And I wanted to talk about a topic which I think is really central to our thoughts about the future. And that's the question of work. How will we be working? When will we be working? Where will we be working? Hi, I'm Lynda Gratton, and I'm very excited to talk with you today about some of the huge trends that are shaping the way that we work and will continue to do so in the decades ahead. And that's the question of work. How will we be working? When will we be working? Where will we be working? So let me just take you through some ideas about what I think we can expect to see over the coming couple of years, and more importantly, what you might do to make sure that the transition that we're all facing works for everybody in your organization. Well, let me start by stepping back for a moment. And I want to remind us all that actually, even before the pandemic, which of course is still taking a lot of our attention, there was still some hugely important trends that were in place that were shaping the way that we worked and the nature of our work. And I've just described three here, which I think are really crucial. The first is demographics. The truth is that we're both living longer and we're having fewer kids. And that means that as individuals, we can expect to be living healthily into our 80s, possibly even our 90s. But as a population, in every country of the world, with a few exceptions, we are an aging population. And you look to Japan and say, well, the average age of Japan is 45, but we're not the same as Japan. Well, it turns out we are. And the next aging population will be China. So we have to come to terms with living longer, and that means working longer, but also living in a society where there's going to be more older people. My book, The 100-Year Life, which you might have had a chance to look at, was really about that. But just as we're living longer, we're also living at a time of intense technological change. And all of us are going to have the impact of both robotics in terms of the sort of physicality of our work, but also artificial intelligence, which is going to be working with us closely in terms of some of the more cognitive aspects of our work. But there's a third trend that I've been watching for years, which is what's happening in our communities and in our families. And whereas I might have been brought up in a traditional family of a dad who worked and a mum who was a carer, that's very unusual these days. Right across the developed world, most women work, and that means that most families have two people who are working, not just one. So those trends were always in place long before the pandemic happened. And what they have done, I think, is really pushed two aspects of human capital. The first is this idea that people are moving from a three-stage life of full-time education, full-time work, full-time retirement, to something you might call a multi-stage life, where people do multiple activities right the way through their life. They might start their own business. They might take time off to travel the world. They might want to work part-time. And the thing about the multi-stage life is there are more stages, and you do them much more in an individual way. So this requires from the individual, from us humans, a great deal more self-determination and agency, and from organizations, a great deal more flexibility around when and where you want people to work. The second aspect of those trends that I spoke of earlier, demographic, technical trends, and social trends, is that we're thinking differently about what's important to us. Now, tangible assets, our savings, the money perhaps we have in our home, our property, our pension, have always and will always be important. Nobody wants to retire at the age of 55 and have very little money for the rest of their lives. But actually, what we're realizing when we live long lives at times of technological disruption, as we are doing, is that there's another type of asset that becomes really important. And those are those intangible assets. In other words, assets that are really important to you, but which money can't buy. And I've described 3 here. The first is around productivity. I think that we should all be working into our 60s and our 70s, because otherwise we're going to have a very poor final decades of our life. But the truth is, you can't really do that unless you've developed your productivity asset. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, learning new skills right the way through your life, building new networks that allow you to learn new things. So being a lifetime learner is going to be really important. But it's not just about productivity. It's also about vitality. How do we stay energized and excited about life? Well, in part, that's to do with our health. We all know how to stay healthy. We have to walk 10,000 steps a day. We have to eat healthy food, lots of vegetables, and we have to sleep 8 hours a day. That's pretty much understood now. But what we also know is that vitality is also about our friendships. It turns out that loneliness is a huge problem when it comes to mental health issues. And so if you want to stay vital, it isn't just about staying healthy. It's also about staying connected to other people. And the third type of intangible asset, I would call a transformational asset. It's the capacity for you to change. Thinking back to that multi-stage life, one of the aspects of that multi-stage life is that you are able to change. You could change from one stage to another stage. How do you do that? Well, as I mentioned earlier, that's partly about your own personal agency. The knowledge that you have of yourself and the knowledge that you have as a human about what you would like to do. But it turns out it's also about the networks that you've got. Finding people who are different from you, who are role models of what you could be rather than what you are. So let me summarize where we are. There have always been, certainly since I've been studying this topic for 30 years, these big trends that have shaped our lives. Trends like we're living longer at a time of intense technological change, and our family structures are changing. Both parents are now working. That set off a real change in the way that we think about our life work, which looks not just at the 3 stages of full-time education, full-time work, full-time retirement, but also to something which is much more multi-staged, where we do different things right the way through our life, and where our age itself doesn't determine what stage of life we are at. And that means that we are now focused on intangible assets as much as tangible assets. So all of this was in play before the pandemic. We knew that people wanted to work in a different way, and they wanted to focus on their intangible assets as well as their tangible assets. But then the pandemic came along. And from that time in March of 2021, I kept a diary about what I saw every single day. In fact, I still have, I think I'm on volume 15 now of that diary to really show what's happening. And I used, those of you who perhaps know a little bit about organizational change might know this theory that companies most of the time are in a state of freeze, in the sense that their practices and processes are all understood and acknowledged. And then something happens, something big happens to the company. Maybe it's taken over by a competitor. Maybe Elon Musk buys it. Perhaps a new technology happens and the whole organization goes into an extraordinary state of unfreeze, where everything's up for grabs. People have an opportunity to ask, why is this happening? What is this? And then over time, it refreezes again, but now in a way that's rather different than it was at the beginning. And you perhaps know that I wrote, I'm looking at it now, in May 2021, the definitive Harvard Business Review article about the pandemic and about the hybrid. And what I said then is I felt that this pandemic had changed our attitudes to how we thought about work. It had given us an opportunity to reevaluate what's important to us and what we want. And that now we were going to move into that final stage where we coalesce around what is it that we need. Let's just take a look at what happened. In the short term, and I think we're still in the short term, there was an enormous focus, particularly on place. The idea is that suddenly you didn't need to work in the office anymore. You could work anywhere. And so you moved from place being a constraint, you have to be in the office all the time, to place being unconstrained. You can work anywhere that you want. And in a way, that's still being played out. We're still having big conversations about who should be in the office, when should they be in the office, and what do they do when they're there. And I expect that to carry on. I don't really see any end in sight of that conversation, because we're learning a great deal as we go. But of course, the truth is that during the pandemic, only about 50% of people had any choice about where they worked. They were, in a sense, tethered to their work. If you are a delivery worker, or you work in a factory, or like one of my sons who work as a doctor on accident and emergency, you cannot work from home. These are jobs that require you to be in a place. And so one of the challenges was, how do you then go about really understanding that time can also be a flex? You could also possibly flex around time. And by that, I mean so that you can work anytime rather than having a constrained 9 to 5. And that, I think, is where we are at the moment. There's a lot of flexibility going on, a lot of experimentation. But in the long term, as you remember, if you've had a chance to read my book, Redesigning Work, which, by the way, is also available as an audio with me reading it. So if you'd like to learn English through listening to my perfect English, then do listen to the audio rather than reading the book, Redesigning Work. So this is what I've said. I've said redesigning work is a design question. And it's got 4 steps to it. The first is you have to understand what really matters. I'll speak about that in a moment. You can then reimagine what work could be. You need to model and test against questions like, is this fair? And then you have to act and create. You have to engage people in that. And actually, as I look around the world, the companies that I advise and research, each of them are going through that cycle. And none of them have in any way completed it. They're still working through it. So what have we learned? Well, I think one thing that we're beginning to realize is that it isn't just about what people want. It's also about what the job needs. And you might remember, if you took a look at my article on redesigning work, that I suggest that you think about 3 types of jobs. Jobs that have a great deal of focus in terms of my job, where I have to sit here and write and think, somehow have coordination tasks where you're coordinating with another person, but you don't have to be synchronous. You don't have to be on the same time zone as you and I are. I mean, I am speaking to you now, but we're coordinating, but we're not synchronous. This is asynchronous coordination. Or you could be highly cooperative when you really want to be together, either on a Zoom call or actually face to face. And I think working out the sort of jobs that you have in your organization and how that works is going to be really important. I think the other thing that we understood is that when it comes to work, it's not just about an individual, it's about their networks. And those networks are really what we're looking at now as we think about the future of work. They might be networks where you innovate because you meet new people. They might be networks where you exploit the knowledge you've already got. They might be networks where you explore through synthesizing ideas. But what we're realizing is that relationships and networks are very important in organizations, and the new ways of working are disrupting them. So we're now faced, I think, with some pretty tough questions and some insights. Let me just remind you of certainly what I'm seeing in the companies that I'm working with around the world. The first is we're beginning to understand what this looks like. For example, we're realizing that the number of meetings that we've put into our diary have gone up by 50%. We're realizing that some people are resigning because they don't like the jobs that you've got. But at the same time, with inflation on the horizon, the job market is cooling down again. We're learning a lot more about how you work in a hybrid way. For example, we're learning that Zoom might be good at selecting ideas, but it's not very good at creating ideas when you're working as we're doing here in a virtual environment. We're also learning a great deal about friendship. And if you're interested in my work, by the way, do go to my website, www.lindagratton.com, and you'll see that I've written quite extensively about friendship and how important that is. I have a column in the Times, so if you go there, you'll also get a chance to take a look at that. But we're also faced with some tough judgment calls, like what experiments should we be doing and what are the risks associated with that? And what happens to our investment portfolio? What's an office actually for? So I think we're beginning to realize that as we think about new ways of working, we have to consider how to model them and test them. And I think that that's 3 questions that you will need to be asking yourself. Number 1, what are the experiments we should be running now to help us understand what's going on? Number 2, what are the red lines? What are the principles that will guide us? And number 3, as we look back, what do we want to protect? What was it about the way that we worked before that we want to protect? And we begin to realize that each organization has its signature approach, its own way of doing things. And let me finish by reminding you that that 4th stage of the design process is act and create. And by that, I mean, how do you engage the whole company in redesigning work? What we've learned is that leaders are very important in terms of the narrative they give about what they believe to be important. But actually, there's a pivotal role for managers who seem to be the golden thread that connects the organizational business and strategy to individual employees. But also, there's this astonishing power of co-creation, the power of actually bringing people together as employees and co-creating with them. So these are some of my thoughts about how we might go about redesigning work. Thank you.
Lynda, thank you so much. That was obviously, you mentioned Japanese examples. It's certainly a bullet train speed of going through redesigning work. Absolutely fascinating. And there's so much depth in what you mentioned. And of course, each slide could be a presentation on its own. Certainly, time does not allow that to dive so deep. But I do have a couple of questions, if I may. And you talk about managers, and let me pick on that thought, because in recent conferences you've run, the managers and the role of mid-managers, it just keep coming back and coming back, how important it is, and somehow managers are caught in the middle. And together with Diane Gerson, you wrote a really interesting article in the Harvard Business Review in actually April, March this year about managers can't do it all, time to reinvent their role for a new world of work. And in that, I'm quoting from that, in recent decades, sweeping re-engineering, digitalization, agile initiatives, and lately the move to remote work dramatically transformed the job of managers. Managers now have to think about making their teams successful rather than being served by them. So what's very interesting, that because managers are being empowered, more and more sort of HR tasks being sort of pushed up on them. They are involved in hiring, they're involved in performance management, they involve their employee engagement, of course, engaging, coaching, and leading the team. But somehow they are caught in the middle. So how do you suggest to approach the question of managers to make sure they are not burnt out, they are not overworked, and they still find meaning in the job while, of course, leading their team and doing their job as managers?
Well, thank you so much for that great question. And you're right, of course, to link back to the article that Diana Gerson and I wrote. So Diane, for those of you who don't know her, had just stepped down as the Chief Human Resource Officer for IBM. So she's got one of the biggest HR jobs in the world, I guess, and she's now teaching at Harvard Business School. And she and I began to talk about the challenges that we saw, and we realized that as you talk about human resource strategy, there's a group called managers who are sort of sitting in the middle who have to deliver on that. And what we realized is that they were just burnt out. And as you say, and we have data now that we're collecting all the time, and that burnout continues. So Dan and I made a number of suggestions, and we have details of that in the article, but let me just remind you what those were. Well, one suggestion is a whole restructuring suggestion. And this, we looked at a company called Telstra, which is a Australian telecoms. And they said, we're going to split the job up. It's too much for any individual. So what we're going to do is we're going to have managers, leaders of work, and leaders of people. And the leaders of work manage the work part of it. So this is a company that's going agile. So everything is based in project teams that are reconfigured. Unusual, actually, in telecoms. And so they have a whole group of managers who are just there to manage work, to schedule work, to see sort of what work's coming up, to make sure that people are trained to do these new jobs. And then they have managers of people, which are much more around helping each employee be the best they can. And that's what I really found interesting. So really more of a coaching role, actually. So that's one idea. The second idea, coming on to this idea of coach, was something we saw in a couple of companies, particularly Standard Chartered Bank, where they've trained their managers to be coaches. So, they've said coaching is a really important part of your job. We're going to certify you to be a coach. So we're going to give you coaching skills, and we expect that that's what you're going to do. And then the third idea, which is actually an IBM idea, is to use artificial intelligence. Now, no surprise, IBM has got that wonderful AI, Watson, who can do a lot of things for you. And so, there is really taking stuff off the manager's plate by using artificial intelligence to remind you of what the pay grades are, remind you of what people's performance ratings has been over the last 5 years and so on, and really to do a lot of that admin stuff. But actually, certainly at IBM and a few others, that's really using the power of artificial intelligence in terms of, scraping the data from the organization and coming back to the manager and saying, we think that one of your employees is about to leave. They're high risk, and we've now got enough data to suggest that's the case. So really also acting as an intelligent co-worker, as it were, and bringing to you problems and ideas that it sees that the data is suggesting. So, I think there's much we can do, but what was very clear from Diane and my work is we actually have to do it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And bringing on those, continuing on those ideas. Certainly you mentioned, I loved from your presentation, the growing importance of intangible assets. And that was in 2007, actually, with Tammy Erickson. You wrote a really interesting piece in Harvard Business Review on what it means to work here. And you mentioned that companies that successfully create and communicate signature experience and understand the different types of people will excel at different companies, and not all workers want the same things. So it's interesting that by now we would like to believe that we've made some progress in the past 15 years. Obviously, employee experience has been sort of a priority for organizations, even prior to the pandemic. During and after the pandemic, now it's even more important. So, with considering the importance of the intangibles, how would you suggest to reimagine employee experience from the intangibles point of view?
Well, that's a great question. And what I would say is that what we learned, looking particularly at the 100-year life, which has been this is the follow-up, the new long life, is that, people are different, both in terms of their character and personality, but also importantly in terms of their life stage. I'm 68 years old now. I don't have the same expectations or needs as I had when I was 30. So, acknowledging that people are different primarily because of their life stage, I think is really important. And then realizing that what they need at that moment in time, you have to give people flexibility to make those choices. And that's, I think, what I've learned since I wrote that article with Tammy Erickson all those years back, is that we somehow had it in our mind that we would personalize the experience and present it to people. But what I've realized now is you don't need to do that. You just need to give people choices, and they will make a decision about what's best for them. And that's why I think the pandemic has been really important, because what the pandemic has done is it has created opportunities for people to make choices around both the place they work and indeed the time they work. And so that's why I was very keen to write this book, Redesigning Work, as fast as I could, because I was very conscious that if we go back to the past and simply recreate the past, that would be a lost opportunity. So intangible assets are built because people have autonomy. They have a choice about how they work and when they work.
Very interesting. Of course, you work with several large organizations, members of HSM Hotspot movement. Do you see that actually we are making progress and companies are actually consciously aware and making conscious choices to consider intangibles when it comes to employee experience?
Well, I think, interestingly, the companies that have moved the fastest tend to be ones where the head of marketing has taken control, as it were, of the employee experience. So I'm thinking, and I wrote about it in the book, actually, HSBC, one of the big, global retail banks. It was the head of marketing who said, we have a whole way of thinking about our consumers, our consumer insights programs, but we're not using those methodologies within employees. And she said, we know more about our consumers than we do about our employees. And so those sort of marketing technologies, which is really about looking at people's day-to-day experiences rather than just, one of the challenges I think we have with HR is we have very ritualistic interactions with our employees, like, they're being reviewed or they're being trained or they're being selected. Whereas actually what marketing does when they look at a consumer, they look at all of their touch points as well. For example, when a consumer has a baby, then their buying habits change. The same with an employee. When an employee has a child, their habits change, but we tend not to think about those. So this idea of looking at people through events, I think, is really important. And once you do that, you realize that intangible assets become extremely important to people at particular times of their life. So, for example, as people get older, we know that learning new skills is absolutely crucial. So how do you provide opportunities for people to learn new skills so they can carry on being productive? Or how do you give them time so they can stay healthy? I try to walk 10,000 steps a day, but that takes me more than an hour. Well, that's already quite a big part of my day. So helping people make those choices is going to be really important.
And probably during those walks, you get these amazing ideas and great reflections, what you're generously sharing with us. Thank you so much for that. And interesting in marketing, you mentioned technology before, but probably here as well, technology can certainly help, because marketing is really superb when it comes to sort of a hyper segmentation, really individualization of marketing services. And it's something probably in HR we should be picking up even more so. And now
yes, exactly.
Potentially
exactly.
here to help. What I'd like to, last but not least, a question about culture. Obviously, when the pandemic sort of started ending, we read in the news how companies sort of trying to bring people back in the office in softer or harder ways. Interestingly, Cisco's CEO, I just watched this interview last week. He said office should be a magnet, not a mandate, and that was a very nice and refreshing way of looking at office work. But many of those who are opposing remote and hybrid work, they say that, well, it's not our culture. In fact, we cannot really preserve our culture if people work remotely. In fact, during the pandemic, thousands of people were hired and onboarded remotely without even stepping in any office building. So how do you suggest, for those who are actually opposing hybrid and remote and flexibility, how would you suggest to preserve or even strengthen the corporate culture without losing corporate identity, even in the remote and hybrid work environment?
Well, I think I was sort of very fortunate when I wrote Redesigning Work to meet somebody who runs a company called Artemis, which is entirely virtual. This was long before the pandemic. It was actually built as it's a management consulting practice, completely virtual. And what she talked to me about, and I wrote about it in the book, is this level of intentionality, which is to say, you have to ask yourself, what is it about the culture that's really important in this organization? So in her case, the culture was really about learning, about taking risks with each other. And so they very intentionally said, how do we demonstrate that culture? What is it that we could do so that people really feel, okay, I'm learning, I'm taking risks? And so, for example, they did a huge amount with peer learning, where people learned from each other. They could learn across peers. They also, peer groups, they also really thought about experimentation and what could we do to demonstrate that. So I think being intentional is very important. The second piece is about hybrid, and it's turning out that hybrid is particularly difficult because you're not building the company to be virtual and you're not building it to be fully back to the office. It's something in between. And that in between is very complicated, as it turns out. And so again, you need to actually design work. And as you heard from the Cisco CEO, if you want people in the office, then it has to be a cultural experience. Nobody wants to come into the office and sit on Zoom all day. That's not a cultural experience. So what I'm seeing companies are doing now is creating events not just spaces, but also events that actually demonstrate what is it to be in this organization. And it's not just, oh, you know, we're having coffee and we're eating cakes all the time, although I'm the first one to say that's a great idea, especially Turkish cakes. But really more, you know, let's learn something together. Let's do some voluntary work together. So how do you actively create your culture rather than just passively talking about it? And I think in many ways what the pandemic has done is it's made us all realize that we were getting into very bad habits around work. We were just assuming that people would come into an office every day and we could tell them what to do, and that was it. And now that it's become more complex, I think we've had to really think more seriously about the design of work and also the possibility of redesigning work.
Indeed. And of course, you mentioned it's the involvement of people understanding what matters for them as their intangibles.
Yeah.
Let's design culture together. How do we want this company to look like? So fantastic, Lynda. Thank you so much for this interview. Absolutely brilliant, fascinating speaking with you. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, get a copy of Redesigning Work as a great guide, as a great playbook for redesigning work. Fantastic work. And I understand that you're also working on the next book after Redesigning Work.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not working on any book at all. No. But I am working on a Harvard Business Review article. But you're not going to see that till April of next year, which is basically asking what happened with redesigning.
Looking forward to that, because there's so much confusion around the topic. Yeah. Hopefully, your book will certainly get some clarity on that. Thank you so much, Lynda. It's been absolutely
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.